Nowhere and no one seemed safe. Power was great, but what was the sense of possessing such power and not being able to enjoy it? It didn't make sense to DUDUS, and soon safety became a literal obsession throughout his reign. He had seen up close and personal the end result of the Don who got too comfortable, and DUDUS literally made every effort humanly possible to avoid falling victim to such level of contentment. Like it is said, hindsight is 20/20, and the mistakes of the past were so obvious that almost immediately DUDUS set out to rectify what he felt should have been rectified years ago. DUDUS may have been bestowed with the title of being a political activist, but a little-known truth is, DUDUS wasn't all that big of a politician as many may have been led to believe. His interest in this arena was actually minuscule. He understood its significance and how manipulatively important it was for the masses. But from his personal perspective, uttered countless times in the presence of many, DUDUS viewed politics as a vice whose time had passed. It had served its purpose. The politicians had gotten what they wanted, power, and they, individuals like himself, had achieved their objective, financial independence, and from his new vantage point, he no longer saw what the politicians deemed and preached as important, or significant. Why should he, when it wasn't politics that had made him or anyone he knew for that matter, wealthy? It is said that the apple never falls far from the tree, and such was the case in DUDUS's life, because like his father, he was progressively independent in his thinking, so he already had plans to rid himself and his power base of political dependence. He saw much more value in those under his command. He had seen it done, and he was ready to duplicate it, but he had to address the issue that was haunting him, the issue of safety. A lot was his, for the taking, but a lot was also at stake, and after certain kinks were worked out, the smoke cleared and certain critical pieces thought to be firmly in place, DUDUS eventually started to make the moves he had envisioned, mainly to his newly acquired territories, where he was always received like a visitation from some extraterrestrial being. But this just didn't happen overnight. At first it is said that as good as DUDUS was talking about spreading his wings and empire, and all the sense he was making, when it actually came down to doing it, even with all the plotting and scheming that had been done, and was still being done at the time, hesitation weighed heavy on his shoulders, even at times acting as if he wasn't even interested in venturing outside of Tivoli Gardens. He just didn't trust all this moving around, explained one tight-lipped individual, acting as though he knew way more than he was willing to add to the conversation. Under the circumstances, behavior of this nature is extremely understandable. But even so, he still had a theory that needed testing. DUDUS had a plan, he always had a plan, and in this case, it was actually a damn good one, even with the risk factor attached. He however knew he had to stick to it to be successful. He couldn't appear like all the others before him, limited to the borders of Western Kingston. According to accounts, the way he saw it, if all he was a duplicate of his father and a reminder of his brother, then all he was doing was living in their shadows. And that, he could not have. His guns and his dons were in place, but still there was an issue when it came to clearing the hurdle of timidity, even with decoys and seemingly unassociated cars and motorcycles always around, ahead, behind and sometimes even beside, presidential style. Eventually, DUDUS started to make moves, and when he did, they resembled scenes from some big-budget Hollywood production. His moves were always incognito, but at the same time, very unorthodox when it came to a Don. But this was DUDUS, he was going to do it his way or no way. Guns were always around, but DUDUS made a rule never to travel in any vehicle that had a weapon in it. There were other vehicles for that, strategies later replaced by the evolution of secret compartments and elaborate stash spots in vehicles. Then there were always the riders. Some of the best motorcyclists are said to come out of Western Kingston, led most times by one of his most vicious inheritances, a blessing and curse of sorts. If some were to tell it, the notorious Nunupus. A team which was always armed, ready for action and a quick getaway. The decoy cars came next, the vehicles with a few men who looked the part enough to draw attention and distract, but who in reality were never any real threat. They just looked the part, a necessity of sorts for the police who always seemed to go after obvious-looking targets. The gunners were however the real danger, the killer transporters. 2, 3 or more vehicles, who traveled in front of, behind or alongside DUDUS wherever he went. This was where the real firepower was. Pilots were also a part of the detail, those who went ahead, acting totally separate and apart, but who were always there in the shadows, if for no other purpose, precautionary reasons. It didn't stop there. The final element was the so-called double check, another team of men either in heavily tinted cars or on motorcycles, who always just happened to pop up and do a spot check wherever DUDUS was. Sometimes discreetly, sometimes not so discreetly, just to make sure all was well. This was DUDUS's security detail, which only got better and more sophisticated as time progressed. Room for error? None. DUDUS may have been who he was, but truth was, his reality was way different from the reality of any regular youth growing up in any one of Kingston's inner city communities. No doubt, his reality had benefits, but it also had its drawbacks, one main one being, exposure to the wider world was limited, and according to many, this was a stumbling block in the early years of his reign. Except for the areas surrounding where he went to school, Tivoli Gardens and its environs, DUDUS wasn't too familiar with too many other places outside of those borders in any real depth. For one, he was the son of a Don, who had a whole bunch of enemies, political and otherwise, so he had to be sheltered. So in reality, all that he had taken on as a new Don, was new, really new. In more ways than one, but like almost every single thing in life, time has a funny way of injecting change, at times rather suddenly. It did take a while, but upon realizing the magnitude of respect that actually existed outside of Tivoli Gardens for Tivoli Gardens as a whole, and the type of respect that was his, simply because of who he was and the position that he had now inherited, DUDUS eventually started relaxing in his new role, at least so it seemed. Little Jim was in town, the fringe benefits that were his for the taking and partaking of, in each and every one of these territories were vast and tantalizing. Men lined up to take orders and women lined up to take whatever it was that the Don and his team felt like issuing at any given moment. Nothing was off limits to DUDUS and his crew. There was a Don in charge of everywhere he went, a Don who controlled all things in that realm, and he, DUDUS, controlled him. He was the Don's Don. It didn't take long for DUDUS to get his feet wet, and was soon laying down the law according to the Tivoli Gardens Handbook. In regions as close as Fletcher's Land, another JLP stronghold, in the downtown Kingston region of Kingston's capital, and even as far as Grant's Pen, also another traditional JLP stronghold in the upper regions of St. Andrew, quite some distance from Tivoli Gardens, physically. According to some of those who claimed to have accompanied him on these early expeditions, they explain that it took a while, but Precy eventually and actually started to enjoy making the rounds, especially with him able to move around literally unnoticed, because unlike his father and brother, most individuals outside of Tivoli Gardens didn't have a clue what DUDUS even looked like, until recently. General is a man wan you to love to road, but is a man wa we just see what ya, we make a flex, and is all a next dating before we touch back the base. Is a man wa work offer him vibes, more time road don't even mention, but a next time, up your trampus and ends out, especially if is a spot wajia him a vibes. Translated, General, another name for DUDUS, was not a person that loved the road, but he is the type of person who will just get up and say, let's go, and it might be the next day before we get back to the base, Tivoli Gardens. He works off his vibes. Sometimes the mention of going on the road is not even up for discussion, but another time we would just be out, hanging out, especially if it's a spot that gives him a good vibes. Inexperience in any field can be critical, and DUDUS was no exception to this fact of life, because while DUDUS was busy getting familiar with his role and all that it entails, just starting to enjoy the fruits of his labor, things were quickly going contrary to how he had envisioned them. All wasn't well in Gotham. When Jim Brown was around, everyone knew who the Don was and knew what to expect. With JT it was pretty much the same, but although it was known that DUDUS was in charge, with no real track record to go by, both fear and respect were fickle, the lack of which soon evolved into actions fueled by ignorance, motivated by ego and self-centeredness. With no obvious force to reckon with, at least so it seemed. A few independent entities had a few ideas of their own, and whether DUDUS was involved directly or not, the weight and blame of what they did rested firmly on his shoulders. It was his territory. By the time 1994 rolled around, DUDUS, just somewhat settling in his role, was faced with what could be labeled as his first major crisis as a Don. Problems were on the horizon. The Shower Posse was again in the headlines. Vivian Blake, the reputed leader of the Shower Posse who had been on the run for over 5 years, was now in the custody of the Jamaican authorities, and like his co-defendant and DUDUS' father, Jim Brown, he was about to start an extradition battle that could last just as long or longer. It was what it was, but to make matters even more complicated, this development flicked on the switches that governed the spotlights again, and they were all pointing in DUDUS's direction. With Blake now in custody, questions surrounding the Shower Posse started to circulate again, and so did DUDUS's name. But if that was all he had to be concerned about, then maybe he would have been fine, but on the contrary, DUDUS's problems were far greater. Number 1 on a list of 13. Many reasons have been given and speculations have been countless as to why DUDUS and Mr. Seaga never really got along like all the previous West Kingston area leaders or Dons, but whether it was because Mr. Seaga didn't really know him, like he did JT, or because DUDUS just simply refused to take any talk from him, due to how he viewed him when it came to his father's demise, one thing was for sure: DUDUS and Edward Seaga had never really seen eye to eye, and weren't going to, at least not anytime soon, a general perception of most Tivoli Gardens and West Kingston residents, at least by 1994. Development. At this particular time, there seemed to be what was the equivalent of a flood of guns in the streets of Kingston, which eventually gave birth to a reckless and brutal upsurge of daring robberies, in and around Jamaica's capital, Kingston. Interestingly enough, although there were and still are many armed fractions all around the city, all these acts were said to have been committed by men from Western Kingston, Tivoli Gardens to be specific, and Mr. Seaga, then Member of Parliament for said community, was pointing fingers and calling names. DUDUS did it. Call it a moment of irony, but Mr. Seaga himself pinpointed DUDUS, Christopher Coke, as the ringleader of these criminal acts. The accusation was that Coke was not only involved, but was also responsible for the crime wave that was wreaking havoc across the city's capital. But it didn't stop there. Mr. Seaga took it a step further, turning over a list of 13 men from his constituency to then Police Commissioner Trevor McMillan, whom he claimed were the chief culprits. But to some, all this was a list of men he, Mr. Seaga, simply could not control. It's believed that DUDUS was at the top of Mr. Seaga's list, a claim not too hard to believe, if what is said of Mr. Seaga's actions is indeed true. It is also said that Mr. Seaga himself had put up a $25,000 Jamaican reward, a handsome sum in 1994, for the arrest of Christopher DUDUS Coke, who again he claimed was the ringleader. This many say was the defining moment that made it clearer than ever that this was not going to be the typical Member of Parliament and area leader, Don, relationship. And still there are some who believe that the whole list of names drama was all one big publicity stunt. on Mr. Siaga's part. Surrounding the same incident, reports also circulated that Mr. Siaga himself said he had warned the criminals, but was told by the Don that since he, Mr. Siaga, did not give them their guns, he could not tell them what to do with them. Commissioner of Police at the time, Trevor McMillian, however rubbished what he also viewed as a publicity stunt on Mr. Siaga's part, stating that he was not going to, and could not by law, round up men at Mr. Siaga's request, or suspicion, without evidence or charges against them. Note: this list was never made public. It is said that the guns DUDUS had put on the street were out of control and that he had lost control of them. Yet some say that all that was happening was by design and not as random as it was presumed to be, or even as it appeared to be. Yes, there was a string of daring robberies around the time in question, and according to many, yes, they all in one way or the other had a lot to do with men from Western Kingston. But contrary to what many have been led to believe, another story goes that the guns weren't out of control as they were thought to be. They were actually unleashed. Always more to the story. Briefly referred to earlier. The story goes that Ziggy Marley, son of reggae legend and former Trenchtown resident, Bob Marley, was building a recording studio almost on the border of Rimmer and Trenchtown. This was an effort of social empowerment on Ziggy's part, who was desirous of providing an outlet for inspiring musicians from the community. But as admirable as Ziggy's effort may have been, this was a piece of real estate that Coke viewed as under his control, and with that, it meant that whatsoever was going on in said territory, or on this piece of land, had to go through him, which in this case meant, the contract for impending construction, was to be his. A reality that Ziggy was either unaware of, or just didn't have any regard for. Some have even said that the young Marley viewed the demand of the Tivoli men as presumptuous and outlandish. And rightfully so according to many, because this was Ziggy Marley, Bob Marley's firstborn. He was building a studio for the community, so how could you infringe on that? He was who he was, and the son of who he was, so who was this DUDUS, who no one outside of Tivoli actually knew, feared or had reason to fear? It is said that Ziggy shrugged off all the talk of retaliation for his violation as just idle chatter, not once according to sources, taking the situation serious. But what he didn't know, was that such a move came with life-shortening potential. Ziggy didn't give the construction contract to DUDUS and his cronies, and they were furious. And this some say became the first test of DUDUS presidential powers, activating all the guns that had been distributed, with one intention in mind, sending a very clear message to the legend's son. A new sheriff was in town. Note: this was also the same year, 1994, that Bob Marley was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Retaliation was swift and methods of revenge savage, with a series of killings and shootings that some say left the young Marley griped with fear. The man dem draw everybody in a dem thing, all people who don't even like music. Translated. They involved everyone, even people who weren't into music like that, explained one older Trenchtown resident, who still shakes her head when she recalls the horrors that followed the disagreement of forces. The garden man dem just come and start shoot anybody and anything, dem shoot up the site, dem shoot up the worker dem just gwan with a bag of things, and one thing just lead to the next. Translated. The men from Tivoli Gardens just came and started shooting anybody and anything. They shot up the construction site, they shot up the workers, and just acted wild and crazy, and one thing led to the next. This was the general consensus of most who found themselves on the receiving end of the gun barrels, and DUDUS had plenty of those to spare. He was sending a message, go through me. Not around me. But although it was delivered, a few other things got delivered in between the constant drive-bys and wanton acts of intimidating shootings. And also robberies and more robberies, each one more daring, more barefaced than the last. DUDUS was implicated, but truth be told, DUDUS was no robber, he had no reason to rob, He had just inherited an empire. Be that what it was on one side of the coin, on the other, it made absolutely no difference what he had inherited or didn't inherit. He was being implicated in acts of criminality, and that's all that mattered. Some have argued that although the sending of the message may have been sanctioned by Coke, he knew nothing about robberies, acts said to be committed independently by affiliates of the Dons he had empowered, the same Dons he had activated, and the same Dons who all had their own agendas, in one way or the other, and who some say were using this opportunity as the perfect cover to further their causes. The heat was on. Eyes were on him again. Vivian Blake's capture had opened old Shower Posse wounds. DUDUS's Member of Parliament had put him at the top of a list of troublemakers, and he was getting a crash course in Murphy's Law. Whatever can go wrong, usually does. Things were wrong. This wasn't the way he had planned it. He had to regroup, rethink his approach, because so far it was clear that he had taken a path that was leading in all the wrong directions, and he couldn't have that. He had to get it right.